Yeah. So we're going to start the panel now. Okay, so we've heard a lot of interesting talks today, a lot of interesting ideas, and some amazing posters. And so the theme of this NeuroMusic conference was looking to the future. What is the future of our field? So I just kind of liked in this panel to have us come back to think about that question in general. And so I might start by just asking some members of the panel if they want to, there's a few things we could talk about. I think a big one is, what are the big questions that our field should be focusing on? A second one is all these new technologies, how can we use them? How can we best put them to work for us to answer those questions? The third one, we've heard a lot about different analysis methods with our new technologies. These new analysis methods become really critical because we don't want to just collect a huge amount of data and not have any way to interpret it. And then finally, for me, the other one is sort of accessibility, context, cross-cultural, sort of all those questions that we really as a field haven't yet addressed, I think, to the extent we need to. So how do we do that? So to me, those are kind of the four big ones, but maybe I'll just start by asking the panel, like, what do you see as the big questions that we should be focusing on? I could start at the end with John. Oh yeah, Giacomo too, let's not forget you. Okay. There's a mic there.
Wow. I mean, I think I talked about some of the big questions that we've been thinking about here at my talk. I mean, as a field, I think this kind of was really brought up in the last talk, this being able to connect the richness of individual experience and emotional experience and sort of interpersonal interactions with the neural and the larger group work. I think that is something that we're all still working on. So really, I guess a call for something that Giacomo mentioned, the holistic approach to kind of getting all the different levels together. It's hard to do, but I think that's really important to keep remembering that these interactions have a deeply social purpose to them. I know, like in my work, it's really easy to get caught up in neural mechanisms and really wanting to understand that in detail, but then bringing it back to, like Isabel mentioned, with the dance study, Giacomo and Felix mentioned, that was a great example of looking in detail, but at the same time, I think your question raised, like, well, what is the purpose of this interaction, and how would the sort of the social consequence of this dancing together affect these more objective measures, like whether the people knew each other or whether they're attracted to each other. Just as one example, I think would be one thing to do. I think as a sort of neuroscience focused person, the challenge is always to bridge like the really interesting human behaviors and questions. We don't really have a neural correlate to those, right? So that's, I think, a constant challenge that I hope we can all think about.
Are we going in order? That feels like it's going to take a while. I don't know. Really? Should I? Or does someone else want to? Okay.
Whoever has something they want to say.
I guess as John was talking, I was thinking, okay, if I'm next in line, what am I saying? I think I'm going to not answer I'm going to flip it and ask another question. Something I always am asking myself is, if we had all the answers, if we knew what we wanted to know right now, like when 2 people or 100 people are in synchrony and what all these mechanisms are, where would it get us? And kind of work backwards, like where are we really trying to go with that? What do we want to know? And even just pretending we did know, then what? And like trying to use that to help us figure out what it is that's important. And that's not to say I have the answer, or even some of the things we're doing in my lab, it's not always that it's clear to me, you know, what's the then what of this, but it's something I do like to ask myself, and maybe something we could add to the conversation.
Maybe I'll switch to Giacomo, and you can take a big sip before you speak, and let us know what you think. What do you think the questions are that we should be focusing on?
Well, one that I thought about while John was talking is, so since this conference is about music, and we often run our experiments in kind of musical contexts, but sometimes we could conduct them in a slightly different domain, sometimes, for example, in speech, or like in a conversation as opposed to a musical interaction, or when it's not about an interaction, but it's about music itself. You could think of different domains, different signals that might elicit different processes. So essentially where I'm going is, I think a very important question is, to what extent what we study is unique to music, and if it isn't, which is, I think, is totally fine, then if it is something that generalizes to multiple domains, why it does. So this is something that I often think of as a big question. If music per se offers something unique to human interaction as opposed to other kinds of interactions. But I find it very difficult to answer such a question with just one or few studies.
Yeah, I think, I building off of that, I feel like when we are thinking about music cognition, we can either use music as a tool to ask something about the human condition, like how do we make predictions, and music is a tool we can use for that, or sometimes we're just interested in why music. So I think those two perspectives have influenced some of my questions, but I think a lot of us are either interested in, like, why do humans even bother doing musical things at all? And that's where I've landed on these social emotional things like John talked about. But sometimes music is just a really functional tool as a psychologist to ask another question. I don't think I'm answering your question, though. What are our next questions? I also think that we probably need to think more about knowledge translation and like connecting to people who will do applied stuff. Like sometimes I feel like I'm in the lab doing stuff in the lab, and I hope that somebody uses that information, but I'm not the specialist who will actually bring it to homes and bring it to depressed parents who might find it useful or functional. So I think we need to just like work towards connecting more, but.
Of course, music therapy related, what I'm saying now. I think it is, when we say music therapy, there's music, we're not talking therapy. So of course we've seen that there is something in it. Also we're talking about then also, so this uniqueness of the music, I think, is so hard to study, and especially when it is in that interactive context. And when you are connecting non-verbally with a patient, so everything that adds to the explanation and the understanding, and also to the evidence of what we are doing when we are working in the therapeutic setting, I think, no matter whether it is the techniques or that we can explain, because that is something we are lacking. We're lacking explanations, and the explanations should be kind of, coming out of that practice of doing the things, doing the music together, and because we can approximate what this study outcome could explain within, let's say, a therapeutical interaction, but it is not necessarily really what is happening in that particular interaction, and how we can look into the modules of that. Sorry, I'm just repeating a little bit of what we already said, but I think this is something, well, I hope that we get there at some point, and
I don't have really anything new to add, maybe just to complement what also you said about the experience of people, especially if you study social interactions. I think it's important to consider actually how participants perceive the situation, because we say we're going to do a more realistic, naturalistic setting, people dancing, moving, etc. But it's also a highly weird situation sometimes. And still also what kind of participants are actually participating, does that make a difference? And to combine on all levels, neural levels, behavioral, and also experiential level, which is maybe the hardest level to study because it's so fuzzy, obviously, but I think that would be great to integrate that as well. And if we have all the answers to all the questions, I don't know, it just made me think about Guillaume Dumas in Montreal, computational psychiatry. He's done a lot of hyperscanning, EEG hyperscanning, and in psychiatry one idea is because social interaction, or a lot of mental health issues are related to social interaction. If you understand the neural mechanisms behind it, once we have collected enough data, analyzed it, etc., we can even maybe apply neural stimulation to change synchrony, for example, to influence social interaction and to help patients in that way. So, and Giacomo, of course, did a lot of work on dual stimulation, and I think in psychiatry there's this idea how to use that in the end. Well, not in the end, at some point.
Okay, so that's some of the things that our panel came up with. I thought maybe we should open up to the audience and just say, what are the big questions for you? They don't have to be super big, but just, you know, in the next 5 years, even what questions would you like us to have answered? Yeah.
I'm actually really curious. Oh, okay. It should be on. Hi. I'm actually really curious about the application of research because neurology and biochemistry is very, very specialized, especially when you have access to these bleeding edge technologies. And there's a lot of really interesting empirical research being done, and some of the processes that come out of that are fairly low risk to patients, but there's this huge gap to actually getting them approved and used. And so how can we actually connect research to patients in like less than 25 years? Because the time gaps are generations. So what are possible mechanisms of that? Like someone could maybe think of that, like how can we connect it faster? Because everything is getting faster and we want to be safe with the patients. We want to help them and not harm them. But how can we actually connect? That's sort of my question.
Yeah, I might just follow up a little bit on that and sort of ask a more general question as well. And this is relating to, I mean, obviously some of the speed of translation is related to safety. I have to say some of the, like I find the dual brain stimulation like totally fascinating, and thinking like we can learn so much from, because we can get into causes as opposed to just correlational data. But it also scares me at the same time, because yes, I can see lots of applications, you know, in therapy that could have potentially great outcomes, but I could also imagine it used for, you know, political or whatever applications that could be pretty bad. So I don't know, maybe that's a question we could also, I mean, I think it is one that we're going to have to address over the next years, because as our technologies really become more sophisticated and potentially more invasive, and perhaps invasive not only in the brain but in our privacy and questions like that. How do people, I can open this up to everybody actually, how do you see the field going forward with these new technologies that open up, you know, tremendous possibilities for good, but also, you know, potential possibilities for bad? At the back.
Thanks. Just a little question. I was really impressed with the growth and the availability of different technologies and how they're being applied. And a lot of this is a work in progress, and sometimes the meaningfulness and relevance of the data that's being shown, I can see that people are struggling with how to interpret it and then how to apply it. One of the questions that came to mind for me is more sort of from the standpoint of an untrained social observer. Are we at a place, or have we already been at a place, and this is being done, where we're looking at how the very rapid changes in society and the kind of relationships and the kinds of interconnectedness that we have is changing our brains? Are they changing? Not necessarily neuroanatomically, and perhaps not so much physiologically, but are they changing in terms of how they function, and from a layperson's standpoint, how they light up? And how is this influenced by the kinds of things that we're exposed to in different social segments for a not very long time? Fads that come and go, short attention spans, and then specifically the different kinds of music that we listen to. And that's an overgeneralization, because there are so many different kinds, and they hang around, and some are more enduring, some find their place in derivative form in other genres of music. Are we looking at how our brains are changing? And if they are, so what? It's not like we're going to start re-educating everybody, because we would like people to have, well, this is my bias, longer attention spans and a greater interest in in-depth analysis. But I'm wondering if this is something that we're looking at.
Let me open it up to the panel first. Does anyone want to comment on that?
I'm circling on a way to connect a few of these questions and comments, and one thing that's to this question of how could you more quickly from what, to an applied context. And I come from the US originally, and so I'll speak in that context because I don't really know the Canadian system yet, but I had some former colleagues that had gone through the whole FDA approval process to get a video game certified as a drug that could be prescribed. And it was an audiovisual, there was music in there. I mean, it was really to train, motor skills and other types of skills, and it really had FDA approval, and doctors really could prescribe it. But that model, at least in the US system, isn't always so functional. And in the end, they had originally gone that route, and in the end, they ended up calling it an over-the-counter drug, so that the doctor wouldn't need to write a prescription because of all the barriers to even getting a prescription. So these over-the-counter medicines, I mean, you could think of technologies that we have being somehow in the form of over-the-counter medicine, but in a similar or opposite vein would be that it's trivially easy now to create an app on a cell phone, and we all use apps all the time, whether it's like Duolingo or something that's going to train your brain to not get old, kind of, like these brain games to keep you young and agile. And I think to the danger point, what's our role as scientists in being careful about that? Like, obviously we're on the slow end of this, we're maybe not the ones going from our research findings to an app, but actually else is, right? Like they're going to claim neurotechnologies to enhance whatever, and the public won't know the difference, whether it's good or bad or just total nonsense. And so maybe we could also think about our role in mediating that, because I think you've asked an interesting question. Like, we want it fast when it's something that could really help people, but we also want it slow when it's something that could really harm people. And I guess to Laurel's point, I sort of worry with this speed at which things can, that you could have a lot of dangerous stuff happen without any checks and balances on that.
Quick comment. Tick, tick, tick. Okay, just a very quick comment to that. I mean, on this watch, I have a chance to find out about my heart rate to some degree. So the whole e-health application are already there, so that, as a consumer, you start using all these tools to find out about yourself, about your state, and so on. And I think a lot of what we are kind of creating and knowledge, of course, but at some point go into that, which may be a good way of supporting our daily life, but also, of course, there's some danger to it. I mean, the whole longevity discussion, looking at that, how much of the tools that would help me to really find out about my energy consumption and all this. And in this way, I think, yes, we're changing our brain in kind of focusing on measures that we might have not been looking at while these things were not there. So this, I think, where it all transfers into, and that could be a game, you know, so at some point, and yes, there could be misuse of that.
Yeah, I might just comment on that too, trying to bring the conversation back to music. I'll get to you in a sec. I guess one of the things about music that we all seem to value and that so much research has been done on is the interaction, the human-to-human interaction. And so I think with video games and, you know, what you're talking, focusing on sort of physiological measures rather than looking at the person and getting, you know, whatever cues they're giving us in the traditional way. What's the role of music in this whole conversation about how we want to interact with others in the future? Is music special in that way? Maybe there's something about music that actually is different from some of the other interactions that we have. Can we take, if that's true, can we take those elements that are really critical in virtual reality situations? You know, or is that a bad thing to do? And we really want the human-to-human interaction, or can we actually replicate most of that in a VR setting? And, you know.
Oh, well, so thanks for addressing some of what I was saying. We kind of started talking about bringing it directly to consumers who don't know what they're doing. But I guess what I was talking about is bringing it to more like clinicians, because I see this huge gap between the research and even getting it to clinicians. Like medical doctors have very little knowledge about neurobiology and biochemistry, and they're not allowed to do it because of their college, which I get it, like it's keeping it safe. So then how can we create some sort of interdisciplinary interactions between people who are researching and they're getting really deep and actually bringing it to clinicians who have education, but maybe they're actually working with clients, like that level of connection where there is someone who's educated and can sort of take the validity of, connecting clinicians with researchers, because I see that gap there. Connecting neurology and biochemistry with medical doctors, and that kind of thing. Like I come from autism, so some of the research trickling down to clinical practice for behavior analysts as it's happening. Not putting it in the hands of consumer, but putting it in the hands of mediators like clinicians. How can that happen? Because maybe that could happen through I don't know, like at a university or institute kind of level, actually taking research and bringing it to clinicians faster, who can then be the bridge to delivering it to the population, kind of thing.
Giacomo, do you want to answer that or comment on that, or you guys are maybe the best, whatever?
This one is a bit tough for me. I leave it to to you guys. And maybe I take another one later.
Jörg, or?
I can give a short comment to that. I think in order for that to happen, I think there needs to be a closer cooperation so that people doing more basic research, asking relevant questions that are relevant for clinicians and for the real world, kind of. And that, of course, that there's a huge movement in that field, and we are doing that. But I think there needs to be maybe a bit more cooperation so that the right questions are being addressed in research, and that can be then more easily, more direct transfer to the clinical fields. And then it's also up to us to communicate that and what that means.
I mean, for the therapies, there are certain things that you can kind of transfer, of course, to from the observations to the clinicians. And one of the things that, for instance, was very important is that when you receive music therapy, that the parents were able to sleep for a night in autism, which because otherwise the screaming was going on. And after that, so there is a lot of things that when that goes into the daily life, so that the observations that we have from the practice that then can be, told that this particular person, after receiving that intervention, had that effect, and that might be then of importance for the doctor for the clinician to make a new kind of intervention plan. So, but yeah, in general, I think we're driven from our interest in our research, and of course that brings the research forward. And so when that overlaps with the clinician side, that can be very good. But yeah, what is the best way of going there? I have no best idea. I think as long as we try to be as not authentic is the right word, but as conscious and conscientious enough to really work on getting answers to questions, I think that's of importance. But I think this is quite a general statement in a way.
Okay, I was just going to add. I mean, we have a role to play in all this, just making sure that our research is communicated broadly to the public, right? And that both forces us to answer Lauren's question of why are we doing this, but that would be another suggestion.
I want to add something about
Hi,
trying
hello.
to. Sorry.
I wrote it down because I wanted to ask a specific question. So, people have mentioned advances in technology, analysis methods, etc. But in the last 20 years, even in the last 5 years, think Apple AirPods or TikTok, how has musicking or our musical habits changed, and how will it change in the future? And is this reflected in the research questions that we ask? So the musicking itself, musical behaviors.
I think that's a great question, and I think about it a lot when my toddlers request certain songs from Google. But I also think we can extend it even further back in history. How has music changed in the last 100 years? It's changed dramatically, right? Now we have musical recordings and we can hear music from all over the world, and we don't have to actually happen upon trained professional instrumentalists in order to hear something. So yes, I think it's changing quickly now with our early access and our agency to just stream anything we want, and the algorithm is bringing us into a rabbit hole of a certain musical style, but it's also just changed. It's been changing. Yeah.
I'll piggyback on that. I think it's a great question, and anyone who knows me knows it's kind of a soapbox that I'm on. That if we go back 100 years, right, our field, there's some methods so baked into this field, that so often we're reducing music to audio. We use all these toolboxes to distract audio features, but music historically would have had to be multimodal. It's visual, it's social, right? You had to be physically co-present to make it, and it was never just audio. It's only with recording technology that music is audio alone. So I do think we all as a field have a tendency to think of music as sound, just sound, and in my mind it's much more than that. And I wonder, with the new technologies you mentioned, or where we end up going. But I think maybe a response to that would just be to think about what we care about. Obviously, you saw in my research that I at least think of it as audio-visual, but there is a tactile component. There's all kinds of other modalities in there that we don't tend to get into, even in all these multimodal, rich data streams you've heard about. And I was really struck by your talk, Laura, the synthetic music exposure compared to real music. Or I don't know how, sorry, I forget the terminology you use, but I think more and more, I guess, that our experiences would be becoming that. And it is interesting to think about no value judgments here, but how that changes what we're studying and what we're doing.
Well, and I think there's ways to make the synthetic more real, right? Yeah. Sorry, I did have a quick thing. I think it's valid to be like worried that the way that we engage with music is going to be like tainted by technology and new trends. But at least one like kind of interesting piece of data to mention is that like I think sometimes people are worried that, oh, maybe parents don't sing to their babies anymore because they can just ask Spotify to do it for them. And that's not the case. Like, people are still reporting singing to their babies just as much as they were 30, 40 years ago. So, and there's like intergenerational transmission of the songs that are being sung. So at least from the perspective of parenting, I think maybe technology provides us with like a lot more options and variability and maybe access. But at the end of the day, we're not going to stop singing lullabies to our babies. So.
Well, one thing definitely has changed, that the presence of music is different, definitely, because it's all around. So that makes much more possibilities to add music and memory together. So that kind of soundtrack of our lives idea is something that the technology has given to us in a positive sense. So we're really tracking our life along, number one hits, whatever, how you want to call it, or when listening to this and that. So I think this is something that is different already.
I think there's a question here.
I want to bring back to the question Laura raised earlier. What are the big questions that should be asked? I think one of those questions is cross-culture comparative analysis. I think Laura advocated twice in the conference. I fully agree, because much of what we know about music has been primarily based on Western music, and without a validation, cross-culture, all the geometry, all the practice. I think that's very important scientifically, because for us to know, I'm a neuroscientist, what does brain to do musically? You really have to look across culture, just like the speech language studies. If all you does is just one language, then you really don't know what is the language is about, right? So that's, I think, is missing. And that's something that can be done. It can be done here. The Live Lab here can lead such studies, because cross-culture studies need a collaboration between universities, between countries. It's not a single PI study, and this is one of those studies that should be organized top-down with some initiation. So that's my comment.
I really appreciate that comment, and I think it is one of maybe the practical things that we can try to organize as a field. It's sort of, with different research centers in different parts of the world, to collaborate more on, maybe having studies, common studies, so we can look at what are the similarities, what are the differences, what are the many ways in which music manifests itself. I think maybe that is something that as a field we can actually try to implement. Yes.
I would like to focus on the concept of interdisciplinarity, and the fact that, first of all, music and neuroscience is like multidisciplinary, and the big questions I read need to be answered through interdisciplinary teams. So I just want to add one more comment, that most of the people doing music research are musicians, and they're used to playing with other people, and they're used to working together with other people. So we have experienced what it's like to work well with other people, and we can apply that to our work in interdisciplinary settings. Just a comment on that.
Another question, Susan.
Thank you. One of the things I found striking about the last talk about music therapy is that the case where the moments of interest between the clients and the therapist overlap in terms of experiences of joy and also musical togetherness. I find that quite striking, and it makes me think about an answer to Lauren's question about, like, if we had all the answers, what would we be pushing for? And it makes me think about policy implications and funding implications around prioritizing, and maybe music is a special way to do this, bringing people back together. I think we've seen, like, after the pandemic, we haven't quite bounced back to normal levels of interpersonal interactions and combating, like, the loneliness epidemic that we see. And I think that can also play into bringing things to clinicians in terms of, like, this social prescribing movement, where doctors can be encouraged to prescribe social interactions, including things like going to choir practices and stuff like that. And so I see this sort of like combating this slide into isolation that we see happening, or at least I see happening, and sort of providing evidence base for why we can use music to combat that.
Hello, tick, tick, yes. Thank you. To yes, and in terms of, to return to Lauren's thought experiment, if all the questions were answered, to what end, what would we do with it? And to speak to another study that Lauren did on advocacy, we see arts disappearing from education streams. We see the very thing that is being studied here being deprioritized and homogenized in Western culture, imposed globally. How can knowledge mobilization be used in partnership with artists, of whom there are many in this room, to amplify the use, the application of the knowledge that you all are developing, and to perhaps encourage, from a policy perspective, the resuscitation of starving art forms in an education system, and in terms of social value and understanding of the value that they bring to the human experience. Be a comment / question.
Okay. Hello? Hello? Perfect. I just have another question here. We've kind of touched upon this a lot, that this field is getting incredibly interdisciplinary. Like, I was looking at posters, I saw a gut microbiome poster, and I did not have that on my bingo card at a music conference. But from the trainee perspective, are you guys seeing things that are non-negotiables for trainees to stay relevant in this field? Or what advice do you have for trainees where a field is rapidly expanding in all of the things that it encompasses, how to stay relevant and stay on brand?
Great question. And that sort of speaks to the interdisciplinarity too, like how interdisciplinary can each person be? Maybe the panel, do people have comments?
Tie it to the institutionalization and the policies. Laurel and John took out a rant that I wrote in a grant. I mean, they rightfully took out a little rant that I had gone on about, we had to say, what are the challenges of the Live Lab? And I said interdisciplinary. Obviously, it's one of our strengths, but it's one of our biggest challenges because of the way that disciplines are institutionalized here. Like, you have a faculty of science, which we sit in, and then there's School of the Arts otherwise. And I think it can be a challenge to your student question too, like, what ultimate degree do you want your PhD in? And I guess that would guide the skills I would say are necessary, but it's also a challenge at the PI perspective if, okay, my lab combines X, Y, Z, and I want students from all those disciplines, and I do have sort of affiliations with computer science and engineering or neuroscience or whatever, like there's multiple McMaster versions of the disciplines we silo, but actually how each of those admit students is different and the funding models are different, so it also makes it really hard for me as a PI to be able to take all these students from different backgrounds. So I think it really, really becomes a challenge. I'm curious to hear what others have to say about that.
I'm just going to jump in for a second too to say nobody can be an expert in everything. And so I think a big key is collaboration, right? So I don't think our discipline is going to go forward unless we collaborate with people that have different skills and knowledge.
Yeah, just to build off of that too, you have to be good at working with people. So being able to know what you don't know and know how to find that information and actually ask the questions and make the connections. Even the smallest project is never done by one person. Everything is collaborative, and then we can scale up to have these hugely interdisciplinary things. But yeah, teamwork. Sorry.
Giacomo.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So to me, there isn't one key skill you need to have to enter into this field. There's probably a bunch of them. But maybe, as I think some of my colleagues were implying, the key thing is really that when you enter an interdisciplinary field, it can be very exciting because you are exposed to a lot of different things compared to what you have learned during your undergrad or whatever. But at the same time, it can also be overwhelming. And so something that we discuss often in my lab is this thing of when you enter in a lab as a PhD student or as a postdoc to learn horizontally. So that means that you learn from your peers, you learn from your colleagues within the lab itself. And especially if a lab is highly multidisciplinary, it can really be a great opportunity to be every day next to someone who has a completely different background. Like, for example, in my lab, there are 2 engineers, 2 biotechnologists, and 2 psychologists, and they really do have very different backgrounds, yet they now speak all the same language, and they often do learn things from each other. So like something that I think is important is that you like if you enter into a multidisciplinary field, you really have to be willing to continue learning for a very, very much longer time than some people would accept. In fact, probably the learning curve is never over if it is multidisciplinary, right? But maybe this can also be a good thing. So it's really not just one thing. It's more important the attitude to continue learning over time.
Yes, I mean, we want to solve problems, and so it's important to learn how problems can be solved. And problems-oriented learning is, I think, something which is, especially when you're driven from, music research interest, that has to go everywhere. And I mean, in the music therapies, to accept the different perspectives here, if I come from that side, is of importance. There's anthropological thinking, there's psychological, there's psychodynamic thinking, there's all these different kind of thinkings, and they're all part of the picture that kind of brings up musical togetherness in a way. But how does it do it? Well, over time, because we are looking at a time process in the end, but they all have their place, but how to value them? Well, by not negotiating, by not kind of disregarding and say, well, that's not important because it's not from my field, something like this. I think this is it's an attitude thing then, which is maybe of importance, and that's like a no-go. So we have to be open while at the same time decisive in a way.
I think everyone said it very well. I think we have some questions.
There we go. So I thought this question was related to the topic about collaboration. With more access to open data, how could more importance be placed on researchers running new analyses and reanalyzing secondary data? This seems to be a challenge in norm setting, where the norm is to keep collecting new data. So, and then also, does this challenge need publishers to advocate for as well?
Conversation I had like 15 minutes ago. Yeah, I think somewhere along the line, I don't know where, we're teaching our students that collecting data is science, right? It's part of it, of course, but collecting data is such a small part of the journey, and analyzing data is just like, that's where all the interesting things happen, and it takes a lot of time. So certainly in my experience, funders don't get that either. So there are occasionally some funding mechanisms for secondary analyses, but I think advocating for more of those would be certainly worthwhile. But I don't know, does anyone have an idea, like where did you get the idea, or if you even have the idea that, to really be doing science, I need to run an experiment as opposed to analyzing existing data?
I could just comment on that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the question about it being a norm. I think like that's what everyone is taught, and so that's one step in the process. Mm-hmm. But it's worth thinking about whether norms should change or can change.
Yeah, I could add. I mean, you said it right there. That's what's taught. And so to answer this question, two ways I think about it. One is integrating it into the classroom. So in my undergraduate classes, making it an option that instead of collecting data in our lab-based course, they can find an existing data set and analyze that, and even pre-register that analysis. Or there's other kinds of skills I'm trying to get them to think through, like not just fishing around for stuff, but and then at the PhD level, if there's a grad student coming in and if they have their questions, thinking, do these questions really require a new data set, or could we use existing? I think, okay, yeah, I saw Ian right as I said, yeah. Go
ahead. Yeah, I think part of the issue has been this sort of press for hypothesis-driven research, primarily in the medical field, of saying if we're going to have things go into medical practice, we need to have hypothesis-driven research where we can clearly prove that this works and justify, through clinical trials, and that's sort of got into all types of publications. This holding hypothesis-driven research as the highest level, and so if you can prove something in a single experiment to answer a particular hypothesis, that's now the height of science. And so there's been this push to always do a new experiment that answers a single hypothesis. It's really important and kind of pushes forward. And I think we're now moving away from that to realize there's lots of important questions that you can't answer with one experiment. We need series of experiments, we need collaboration, we need models. And so I think we are slowly shifting away from that, and open science, making data available, makes this reanalysis more possible. So I think we're moving away from this single experiment to answer a single hypothesis, but it takes a while, and there is always the concern, what if that move away gets into things like medical research, and we make mistakes. We approve a drug based on these more collaborative, more model-based things, and there's a big problem with that drug. So that's my take on it.
If it's any inspiration to any of the students in the room, I got a postdoc by emailing someone who had written a paper and saying, I have an idea with this data, I want to use it to answer a different question than the one you answered in that paper. And then that led to a collaboration and ultimately a postdoc. So some inspiration for reusing data sets. I think there's, oh.
Thank you so much, by the way. This is always so great to have this panel and this discussion. But I think what I'm thinking about right now is how, going back to the interdisciplinary nature of sort of our field in this group, a lot of what we also end up doing with our data is informed by other fields, right? I can think of 3 or 4 analyses I've done that maybe originated in vision or something like that. So this feels like maybe this is more of like just making things even more complicated, but also for the trainees, like in my own experience, it feels like you can spend a lot of time in your own field learning things, but you also might spend a lot of time looking in other fields, and that can be a good spot to actually look. Like this, at the end of the day, it's actually, we're still pretty young as a field compared to a lot of other places. So it's kind of just a comment, but just to say that You know, I think also the learning curve in such an interdisciplinary field should be steeper because you're just kind of having to keep up with a lot of other things. But that makes you a better researcher too. So you end up being a little bit more familiar with like all the different areas. And I'm just, yeah, if anyone on the panel has any thoughts about that too, I'd be curious.
Okay, well, it is 5:15, and in one more question. Yeah, sure, one more question.
Okay, this is about neurodiversity. I've enjoyed learning from your work from afar today. I'm wondering about the future of music neuroscience in relation to the neurodiversity paradigm. There's a small but growing recognition of neurodiversity within music education and music therapy, and it is a large focus of my applied research. Are there any shifts happening on the laboratory research side?
I've tried to say something here. Well, definitely, I mean, the acceptance, first of all, that there's not just the neurotypical behavior only, and there's neurodiversity is, of course, when looking at the therapies, of course, that is one of the reasons and things doing it, but also kind of ideas on what we are as humans. Are we this or that kind of gender, whatever? All these ideas that are in the background, I think there's a lot of positive changes and acceptance more. So, and whether that is like entries in certain institutional regulations and the openness, I think there's a lot of that going on, and it's learning. I mean, thinking about the studies that have been done from, learning from pictures that have been done in psychiatry, in Princeton, for instance, how the world is seen from a different perspective, you know, because there is a different way of connecting the dots. Has inspired art, expressionism. So that has always been an inspiration. So why should that be different? It's just that the way how we talk about things in a political context, that might be different. But yes, I think there's a good development on that, and I'm not sure if that's really an answer or it's more a comment on that end.
Yeah, and I might just add that I think it did come up earlier, the idea of individual differences and how different people may experience music differently. They may have different preferences. They may interact with other people differently in how they express music. And so that is something that maybe our field hasn't focused a lot on. But certainly we know it exists. And from everything from basic research to how you apply therapy and what the outcome that you want is, depending on who the person is and what their goals are. And so I definitely think that's something that our field needs to grapple with in the future. Okay, so now I think we're at the end. I have to say, I have enjoyed this 2.5 days tremendously. So I just wanted to thank everyone who came and contributed, and your posters and your talks and your questions and your discussions. I heard so many interesting discussions. I feel totally energized to go off for the next 10 years, if I survive that long. So a big thanks to everyone for that. And then just before we go, just a couple shout outs. The Canadian Webinar Solutions helped with all of our live streaming and getting the whole conference organized. So big thanks to them. Huge thanks to Mohawk College broadcasting crew. Yay, thank you so much. Yeah, no. You were amazing to work with, and you know, helped problem solve everything so that everything ran smoothly, so that's wonderful. Wanted to also thank all of our live lab technicians who've been working behind the scenes to get everything done. Elaine, so that would be Elaine Wiskin, Susan Marsh-Rollo, Dan Bosniak, Hanny Tafik, and Sally Stafford. And then the super organizers are organizational volunteers, Emily Wood, Shreth Saxena, Joshua Schlinkting, Sarah Ripley, Cindy He, Cam Prosick. So they really went well beyond expectations. So thanks to them as well. And so with that, I will see you in 2025. Okay.